There are stories so ancient that time itself seems to whisper them. Stories buried beneath dust, forgotten by history, but never quite erased. One such story begins with beings not of this world, sent not to rule, but to guide. They were known as the Watchers. They weren't demons. They weren't gods. They were something else entirely. Chosen by the Creator to oversee early humanity, these celestial guardians held wisdom that could shape or shatter entire civilizations. They descended from the heavens not to conquer, but to quietly guide the first humans, to watch, to protect, to ensure that mankind's fragile steps into existence would not lead to chaos. But something went wrong, terribly wrong. The very beings meant to uplift us became the spark of our downfall. They shared forbidden knowledge, mysteries of heaven not meant for mortal minds. They gave us tools, not only of creation, but of war. They taught us magic, metals, and stars. And from that union of angel and human, something monstrous was born. The Nephilim, giants of legend, tyrants of the earth, children of a union that should never have been. So why is this story hidden? Why was the Book of Enoch, which tells it, cast aside, banned from the Bible, and erased from doctrine? Was it too dangerous, too revealing, or too true? Tonight we open the ancient scrolls. We step into the shadows of forgotten time, and we ask again the question few dare to ask. Who were the Watchers? And why were they really sent here? Stay with us, because to understand what they became, we must first understand what they were. Their mission was not one of power, but of quiet guardianship. But even angels can fall. Long before cities rose, before language took form, before the first sparks of civilization lit the earth, humanity was just beginning. It was a raw and untamed time. Tribes wandered through vast wilderness. Fire was still a miracle. Thunder was a voice from the sky, and survival was never guaranteed. But in this delicate moment, this infancy of humankind, God appointed a group of beings unlike any others. They were not like the cherubim guarding Eden, nor the seraphim surrounding the throne. These were Watchers, a chosen class of angels. Their mission was simple but sacred: observe, guide, protect, not by force, not by miracle, but by presence, to live among humans without interfering, to ensure that this new race, made in God's image, could grow in harmony with the divine design. They were sent not because God feared failure, but because He saw potential, and potential without guidance can become destruction. So the Watchers took their place. From their high places in the heavens, they watched humanity. They marveled at our emotions, so pure, so intense. They witnessed our struggle against beasts, against cold, against hunger. They saw love. They saw sacrifice. They saw dreams forming in fragile hearts. And the Watchers felt something stir within themselves. Not pity, not superiority, but wonder. For within humanity, they saw a reflection of something eternal. They were angels, immortal, vast in wisdom. But humanity, so flawed, so temporary, held something they did not: choice, emotion, a hunger to reach beyond themselves. And it was here, at this intersection of duty and fascination, that the Watchers began to waver. They were not meant to interfere. They were not meant to love. But even angels are not immune to desire. And one among them, Semyaza, would be the first to fall. long before cities rose, before language took form, before the first sparks of civilization lit the earth. Humanity was just beginning. It was a raw and untamed time. Tribes wandered through vast wilderness. Among the Watchers one stood apart. His name was Semyaza, a leader, a voice of reason, a guardian of immense authority and presence. But within him stirred a longing he could no longer silence. He looked down upon the world, and he did not see just humans. He saw beauty. He saw vulnerability. He saw women, mortal, radiant, and alive with something angels were never meant to feel. And he knew the law. The divine command was clear: watch but never touch, guide but never interfere. Still, the line between awe and temptation began to blur, and Semyaza was the first to cross it. But he knew the cost. To act alone would be to fall alone. So he devised a plan. He gathered the others, angels who, like him, had grown enamored with the world below. He spoke not with rebellion, but with reason. He promised unity in their descent. If they were to fall, they would fall together. And so, on a sacred mountain called Hermon, 200 angels made a pact, a covenant sealed not in heaven, but in defiance. They bound themselves by oath, vowing to descend and take for themselves the daughters of men, not just to observe humanity, but to become part of it. This was no accident. It was not a slip or a moment of weakness. It was a calculated choice, a break from their divine nature, a rebellion. And with that, the Watchers descended. They came not with fire or fury, but with wonder and gifts. They brought knowledge. They brought secrets. They brought the mysteries of heaven to the soil of earth. But what they gave would change the course of human history forever. The Watchers were no longer guardians. They had become gods in the eyes of men. And what they offered, humanity could not resist. Knowledge, power, transformation, but every gift was laced with a curse. Because knowledge, when untethered from wisdom, becomes the very seed of destruction. Fire was still a miracle. Thunder was a voice from the sky, and survival was never guaranteed. But in this delicate moment, this infancy of humankind, God appointed a group of beings unlike any others. They were not like the cherubim guarding Eden, nor the seraphim surrounding the throne. These were Watchers, a chosen class of angels. Their mission was simple but sacred: observe, guide, protect, not by force, not by miracle, but by presence, to live among humans without interfering, to ensure that this new race, made in God's image, could grow in harmony with the divine design. They were sent not because God feared failure, but because he saw potential, and potential without guidance can become destruction. So the Watchers took their place. From their high places in the heavens, they watched humanity. They marveled at our emotions, so pure, so intense. They witnessed our struggle against beasts, against cold, against hunger. They saw love. They saw sacrifice. They saw dreams forming in fragile hearts. And the Watchers felt something stir within themselves. Not pity, not superiority, but wonder. For within humanity, they saw a reflection of something eternal. They were angels, immortal, vast in wisdom. But humanity, so flawed, so temporary, held something they did not: choice, emotion, a hunger to reach beyond themselves. And it was here, at this intersection of duty and fascination, that the Watchers began to waver. They were not meant to interfere. They were not meant to love. But even angels are not immune to desire. And one among them, Semyaza, would be the first to fall. When the Watchers touched the earth, they did not come empty-handed. They brought treasures, not of gold or silver, but of knowledge, secrets that had been kept hidden from humanity since the beginning. And the first among them to teach you was Azazel. He looked upon mankind and offered a gift that would change everything: metal. He taught humans how to mine the earth, how to smelt iron, how to forge bronze. Weapons, sharp, unyielding, and deadly, were born from his knowledge. Until then, survival had been a battle of strength and will. But now, it became a war of blades. With weapons came power. With power came blood. Tribes once content to hunt and gather turned their sights toward conquest. Azazel had given mankind the tools of domination, but he wasn't finished. He revealed another secret: the art of adornment, jewelry to seduce, makeup to conceal or amplify beauty, colors, symbols, and charms that stirred desire, envy, and lust. And for the first time, appearance became a weapon. Beauty was no longer just a blessing. It was a tool of manipulation, a mask that hid intentions, a mirror that reflected pride. While Azazel shaped the outer world, another Watcher turned mankind's gaze inward toward the skies. Kakable. He taught astrology. He revealed the patterns of stars and the movement of planets. To humans who once feared the night sky, this was a revelation. The heavens became a clock, a calendar, a map, and suddenly time itself became something to measure and to predict. Harvests were planned by moon phases, journeys by constellations, but soon knowledge became obsession. People sought to control fate, not just understand it. Kings demanded prophecies, rulers clung to omens, and the sky became a source not of wonder, but of power. Then came Armaros. He taught enchantments, spells, curses, mystic arts that once belonged only to the unseen realm. Magic was no longer myth, it became method. And those who knew it, priests, sorcerers, diviners, became gatekeepers of power. They could bless, they could curse, they could shape destiny with a whisper. At first, the world flourished. Farms grew richer, cities formed. Humans began to bend the earth to their will, but something had shifted. The knowledge of the Watchers was never meant to be released without boundaries. It was sacred, too potent, too dangerous, and just as it lifted humanity, it began to unravel them. Weapons fueled war, beauty sparked corruption, magic opened doors that should have remained shut. The Watchers had gifted humanity with power, but power always demands a price, and the true cost was yet to come. Because from their forbidden union of angel and woman, something unimaginable was about to be born. The gifts of the Watchers had already begun to change humanity, but their most dangerous act was not what they taught, it was what they created. From their union with human women came the Nephilim, beings not fully angel, not fully human, giants in both size and appetite, born of heaven but bound to earth. The Book of Enoch calls them great men of renown, but their fame was built on fear. They towered over villages. They consumed not just food but everything: crops, animals, resources, people. The Nephilim devoured the land where they walked forests died, rivers dried, the earth groaned beneath their hunger. But it wasn't just their size that terrified mankind. It was their nature. They inherited the pride of angels, the selfishness of mortals. They were brilliant but cruel, powerful but unmerciful. They made themselves kings. They enslaved whole tribes. They ruled with violence and fear. The world, once young and full of potential, descended into chaos. The Watchers had become corrupted. Their children had become tyrants, and humanity stood on the edge of annihilation. Heaven could no longer remain silent. The Creator saw the devastation, saw the corruption spreading across the earth like a poison, and judgment was set into motion. The archangels were summoned: Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, Uriel, messengers of fire and light. They were not sent to teach, they were sent to purge. Azazel, the corrupter of men, was seized, bound by chains, cast into a deep abyss. His prison was sealed with jagged stones. There in eternal darkness he would await the day of judgment. Semyaza, the rebel who led the Watchers, met a similar fate, chained beneath the mountains, his voice silenced, his glory forgotten. The other Watchers followed. One by one they were hunted, imprisoned beneath the earth, their cries swallowed by stone. But the Nephilim, they could not be chained. They were too many, too powerful, too monstrous. So a different judgment came, a flood, not of rain, but of reckoning. The great deluge swept across the world. Waters rose, mountains vanished, civilizations drowned. It was a reset, a cleansing, a divine act to erase the sins of heaven and earth. When the waters receded, the world had changed. The Watchers were gone, the Nephilim buried beneath mud, rock, and legend. But the memory remained, and so did their legacy, because even though their bodies were destroyed, the knowledge they gave could not be undone, and their influence would live on, in ruins, in myths, and perhaps in the bloodline of mankind itself. Not all the Watchers shared the same fate. Some became legends, others became whispers. While Azazel and Semyaza are remembered as leaders of the fall, there were others, lesser known but no less powerful. Watchers whose gifts were subtle and whose consequences were just as deep. Penemu was one of them. He was not a warrior. He did not forge blades or cast spells. He brought something quieter and far more dangerous: writing. Before Penemu, stories lived only in breath, told by firelight, passed from elder to child. But memories fade, words change. Penemu gave humans the written word. He taught them to carve thoughts into stone, to preserve law, memory, and culture. With writing came history. With writing came civilization. But writing also brought lies. Deception now had permanence. Propaganda could spread like fire. A single false word could destroy nations. Some say Penemu saw what he had done, that he mourned as truth was twisted. And when judgment came, his punishment was fitting. He who gave language was silenced, condemned to wander the void without a voice. The scribe of humanity, erased by his own gift. Then there was Sariel. His name means command of God. And he brought to earth the secrets of the stars. He taught humanity how to read the moon, how to track the sun, how to measure time by the dance of the heavens. Sailors navigated oceans using his wisdom. Farmers planted in harmony with the sky. Civilizations rose, guided by celestial order. But that order was corrupted. Kings used it to control. Priests bent eclipses to their will. Sariel had offered wonder, but mankind turned it into manipulation. Some say he was cast into the abyss like the others. Others say he still roams the skies, a spirit of regret, a star watcher forever mourning what he once gave. Tamiel, the perfection of God, was the guardian of the deep. He taught humanity about water, how to purify it, how to move it, how to live by it. His gifts birthed irrigation, boats, trade across rivers and seas. But he also spoke of water's spirit, its sacredness, its connection to the divine. And humanity, as always, twisted the gift. Rituals became tools of control. Sacred rivers were poisoned. Oceans became battlegrounds. Tamiel's betrayal was slow, subtle. He did not mean to corrupt, but his fascination with human progress blinded him. In the end, his punishment was poetic. He was bound beneath the waters he once cherished, condemned to hear the cries of rivers turn to blood. And then there was Gadriel, the most mysterious of them all. Unlike the others, Gadriel's gift was not creation, but destruction. He taught humans the ways of war, tactics, fortifications, the strategy of battle. But he did more than teach. Some say it was Gadriel who whispered in Eden, who tempted Eve with defiance, who planted the seed of rebellion in the human heart. Literal or symbolic, it doesn't matter. What matters is the shadow he cast. His influence spread like rot, quiet, invisible, but everywhere. For that, his punishment was complete erasure. His name struck from records of the righteous. His presence banished to utter darkness. But his teachings, conflict, pride, ambition, still burn in the hearts of men. The forgotten watchers did not fall in fire. They fell in silence. And sometimes, that kind of fall is even more dangerous. Because while legends fade, ideas endure. And the ideas they left behind, writing, time, water, war, still shape the world we live in today. Even after the Watchers fell, their mark remained, not just in myths, but in stone, the pyramids of Giza, perfectly aligned with Orion's belt, built with blocks weighing over 70 tons, the Baalbek Terrace in Lebanon, stones over 1,000 tons, so massive modern machines can't move them. Göbekli Tepe, older than agriculture, with 20-ton pillars arranged in sacred circles. How were these built? By ancient hands or by ancient knowledge? Some say these structures are proof of divine instruction. Others call it alien technology. And then there are the Nazca lines, etched into desert, only visible from the sky. Were they signals, maps, or messages to those who once descended from the stars? Legends like Agartha and Shambhala speak of beings beneath the earth, beings full of light, full of knowledge. Could these be echoes of the Watchers, or their prison? Their bodies may be gone, but their knowledge still shapes the world we live in. The Watchers were meant to guide us, to protect us, to help us grow in harmony with the divine, but they fell, not by accident, but by choice. And in doing so, they gave us more than knowledge. They gave us a mirror. Because the real question isn't what they did. It's what we've done with what they left behind. Metals became weapons. Writing became lies. Magic became manipulation. Power became hunger. So were the Watchers truly the ones who failed? Or have we become the very reflection of their rebellion? Some believe their story isn't over, that the Watchers are still bound beneath the earth, that their voices still echo through dreams, instincts, and ancient memories. Others whisper of something more chilling, that their knowledge wasn't just taught, it was embedded in our DNA, in our blood, waiting. Some say the rapid rise of humanity, our technology, our thirst for control, our reach for the stars isn't evolution. It's awakening. So the question now is not whether the Watchers will return. The question is whether we ever stopped becoming them. Are we fulfilling their purpose or repeating their mistake? Maybe the Watchers aren't just watching. Maybe they're waiting for us to decide who we truly are.